This equation has never been solved in this department, Professor Halvorsen said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper, something meant to cut, as the chalk dragged across the board in long, deliberate strokes, each symbol stacking on top of the last until the entire front wall looked like a language only a chosen few were allowed to speak. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, cold and steady, reflecting off the polished surface of the whiteboard, and when he finished, he didn't step back right away. He let the silence settle first, thick and uncomfortable, before turning slowly toward the room, his gaze sweeping past rows of students in pressed shirts and open laptops until it stopped, precise, intentional, on Elijah Carter sitting in the last row, hoodie slightly worn at the cuffs, notebook filled with tight, careful handwriting. His pen paused mid-sentence as if the air itself had shifted, but I suppose. Halvorsen continued, tilting his head just enough to make the words feel casual. Some people aren't here to solve problems like this. A few students shifted in their seats. One let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Another leaned back, arms crossed, waiting, the room tightening around a moment no one named, but everyone understood. Elijah kept his eyes on the board, not the professor, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of his desk, the wood cool beneath his skin. Mr. Carter, Halvorsen said, the name landing heavier than it should have. Why don't you come up and give it a try? And just like that, every head turned, not quickly, but deliberately, one by one, until the entire room faced him, waiting, measuring. Elijah felt it in the small things, the shift of fabric as someone leaned forward, the faint tap of a pen stopping mid-rhythm, the quiet electricity of expectation that didn't feel like hope. He stood anyway, slow, controlled, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape that echoed louder than it should have, his backpack brushing against the desk as he stepped into the aisle. Each step forward carrying the weight of something older than the moment, something he'd felt before in different rooms, different voices, dressed in different words, but always the same shape. He walked to the front, stopping just short of the board, the equation stretching above him like a wall of symbols and intention. Halvorsen extended the chalk without a word, a small gesture that somehow felt like a test already decided. Elijah took it, the dry texture settling into his fingertips, leaving a faint dust across his skin. He looked at the equation, not rushing, not reacting, just reading, his eyes moving line by line, structure by structure. The room held its breath without realizing it, seconds passing, stretching, folding into something heavier. Behind him, someone shifted again, another quiet sound of impatience. Halvorsen exhaled softly through his nose, the beginning of a smile forming like a conclusion he had already written. Elijah lifted the chalk slightly, then stopped, the tip hovering just inches from the board, and in that pause, something almost invisible flickered across his face. Not doubt, not fear, something closer to calculation. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hand, placing the chalk back onto the tray beneath the board with a soft, final click, the sound landing harder than any answer could have. A ripple moved through the room, small at first, then sharper, a whisper, a breath, a restrained chuckle that slipped out before being pulled back. Halvorsen nodded once, as if confirming a private expectation. Yes, he said quietly, turning slightly toward the class. That's about what I thought. But Elijah didn't sit down right away. He stood there for just a second longer, eyes still on the equation, as if memorizing it, or maybe letting it go. Then he turned, walking back toward his seat, the sound of his steps steady, even, unaffected, and as he reached the aisle, just before he sat down, something behind him shifted, so small it could have been missed, the faintest tap against the board, like chalk brushing surface without a hand. One student frowned. Another leaned forward. The room, already quiet, somehow grew stiller, as if something unseen had just entered and was waiting to be noticed. The sound came again, soft but unmistakable, a faint scratch against the board like something testing the surface. Elijah paused mid-step, but did not turn around. Not yet. The room held its breath in a way that felt different now. Not amused, not dismissive, but uncertain. One student in the front row leaned closer, squinting at the board as if trying to catch a trick in motion. Professor Halvorsen's hand, still holding the edge of the lectern, tightened slightly. his posture stiffening almost imperceptibly. "Settle down," he said, though no one had spoken. His voice lower now, less certain. The chalk shifted again, rolling just a fraction of an inch before stopping, then tilting upward as if nudged by something invisible. A girl near the window let out a small breath she did not mean to release. Elijah slowly turned his head, just enough to see the edge of the board from the corner of his eye. His expression did not change, but his gaze sharpened. The chalk lifted, not high, not dramatic, just enough to break contact with the tray, and then it touched the board again, drawing a single line, clean, deliberate. The sound of it cut through the silence like a thread being pulled tight. No one laughed this time. No one moved. Even the air felt still, as if the room itself was watching. Halvorsen stepped forward instinctively, stopping just short of the board, his eyes tracking the movement, searching for wires, magnets, anything that would make sense of what he was seeing. But there was nothing, just chalk and surface and a line that had not been there seconds before. Another symbol followed, then another, each one placed with precision, building on the structure he had written earlier. Not random, not chaotic, but intentional, intelligent. The equation was not being erased or altered. It was being continued, expanded, solved. A low murmur tried to form in the back of the room, but died before it could take shape, the weight of the moment pressing it down. Elijah turned fully now, his body facing the board again, his hands relaxed at his sides. He did not step forward, did not reach out. He just watched, the same way he had when he first read the problem. Calm, steady, present. Halvorsen glanced at him, quick, sharp, as if expecting a reaction, an explanation, something, but Elijah said nothing. The chalk moved again, faster this time, connecting steps, simplifying expressions, revealing a path that had been hidden beneath layers of complexity. The professor's jaw tightened, the faint confidence that had colored his voice earlier now gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to doubt. "This is not possible," he said under his breath. Though no one had asked, though no one needed to hear it, the board filled, line by line, the solution unfolding with a clarity that felt almost undeniable. One student reached for his phone, then stopped, unsure if recording would somehow break whatever was happening. Elijah took a slow breath, the sound barely audible, and for a brief second, something shifted in his eyes. Not surprise, not fear, something deeper, recognition, as if he had seen this path before, as if he already knew where it would end. The chalk paused, hovering at the final line, the entire room suspended on that single moment, waiting, not for proof, but for meaning. And then, just before it completed the last step, Elijah spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough to reach the front of the room. "You wrote it wrong on the third line," he said, not accusing, not mocking, just stating, and the chalk, as if listening, adjusted, corrected, and continued. The correction landed before anyone could question it, a subtle shift in the structure that made the entire line tighten into place. And for the first time since the chalk began moving, Professor Halvorsen stepped closer, not with authority but with hesitation, his eyes scanning the third line, tracing the symbols he himself had written. And there it was, small but undeniable, a misplaced assumption, a flaw hidden beneath complexity. His breath caught just slightly as the realization settled in. The chalk did not pause. It continued, now moving with even greater precision as if the path had been cleared, each symbol connecting seamlessly, building towards something complete, something inevitable. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in around a truth no one had expected to face. A student in the second row whispered, "Is this real?" But the question dissolved into the silence before it could find an answer. Elijah remained still, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady on the board, not chasing the movement, not reacting to it, but understanding it, as if the solution unfolding in front of him was not a surprise, but a confirmation. Halvorsen turned slightly toward him, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "You are saying the entire premise was flawed?" he asked, though it did not sound like a challenge anymore. Elijah shook his head once, calm, measured. "Not flawed," he said, "just incomplete." The distinction lingered in the air, heavier than the equation itself. The chalk moved again, accelerating through the final transformations, simplifying what had once seemed impossible into something clear, almost elegant. And as the last sequence began to take shape, the energy in the room shifted from disbelief to something quieter, something closer to recognition. One student leaned forward with both hands on the desk. Another slowly closed his laptop without looking away. Halvorson's reflection appeared faintly in the glossy surface of the board, his expression no longer controlled, no longer certain, but searching, trying to reconcile the version of reality he had built with the one unfolding in front of him. The chalk reached the final line, hovering for just a second as if acknowledging the weight of what it was about to complete, and then it finished, the solution. Standing there in clean, undeniable clarity, every step accounted for, every assumption corrected, the room exhaled all at once, a quiet release of tension that had been building since the first line was written. No applause, no laughter, just silence, the kind that follows something that cannot be undone. Halvorson stared at the board, his lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The authority in his posture had shifted, softened, replaced by something more human, something uncertain. Elijah took a small step back, not toward the board but away from it, as if distancing himself from the spectacle. His voice when it came was steady, almost gentle. "You never asked if it could be solved," he said, "only who you thought was capable of solving it." The statement did not accuse, it revealed, and that made it land deeper. Halvorson's eyes moved from the board to Elijah, holding there for a moment longer than necessary, as if seeing him for the first time without the filter he had carried into the room. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the chalk, not in the equation, but in the space between them. A recognition that went beyond numbers, beyond proof, something that could not be written on a board. And for the first time that morning, the professor had no immediate answer. No one moved at first, as if any sound might disturb what had just settled into the room. The equation remained on the board, complete and undeniable, its clean structure glowing faintly under the fluorescent lights. Professor Halvorson stood still, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, his fingers no longer steady, his gaze fixed on the final line, as if staring long enough might change it, might reveal a flaw he could reclaim as his own ground. But there was none. The logic held, precise and intact. A student in the front row slowly leaned back, exhaling through parted lips. Another shifted in their chair, the soft creak echoing louder than it should have. Elijah did not return to his seat right away. He stood near the aisle, not claiming attention, not avoiding it either, just present, the quiet center of something that had already moved beyond him. Halvorson finally spoke, his voice lower, stripped of the certainty that once filled it. "You said you solved it last night," he said, not looking at Elijah at first, but at the path on the board, as if retracing it might lead him back to control. Elijah nodded once, subtle. "Yes, sir," he replied, his tone even, respectful but not small. The professor's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "Then why did you not write it?" he asked, turning now, his eyes searching Elijah's face, not for defiance, but for understanding. The room leaned in again, not with tension this time, but with curiosity, something softer, something more human. Elijah took a breath, the kind that comes before choosing words carefully. "Because you already decided what would happen if I tried," he said, his voice calm, measured, not accusing, just clear. The statement settled into the space between them, heavier than the equation itself. Halvorson blinked once, the meaning catching up to the moment. Behind him, the board still carried the answer, but now it felt like more than mathematics. It felt like a mirror, reflecting something he had not intended to show. A faint flush rose along his collar. Not dramatic, just enough to mark the shift. "You think I set you up?" he said, though it sounded less like a challenge and more like a question he was asking himself. Elijah shook his head slightly. "I think you expected me to fail," he replied, the distinction again, precise, careful. The professor's shoulders lowered just a fraction, the tension leaving in a way no one else might notice, but it changed the air. The hierarchy that had defined the room minutes ago now felt less rigid, less certain. A student near the window glanced from Elijah to the board and back again, as if trying to reconcile the person with the outcome. Halvorson turned once more to the equation, stepping closer this time, not to control it, but to study it, his fingers hovering near the symbols without touching them, tracing the logic in silence. And for a moment, the room watched him instead. Watched the man who had always had answers now standing inside a question. Elijah shifted his weight slightly, finally taking a step back toward his desk, not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward as if the moment had already passed for him, as if what mattered had never been the performance but the understanding. And as he reached his seat, the chalk on the tray gave one last faint tap against the surface, drawing a single small mark beneath the solution, a quiet underline that no one could explain. Halvorsen noticed it this time, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in realization. The room held that silence again, but it felt different now, not tight, not sharp, but open, like something had shifted that could not be easily returned. And as the professor finally stepped back from the board, his voice, when it came, was softer than anyone had ever heard it before. "Class dismissed," he said, not as an order, but as a release, and no one moved right away, as if they all understood that something far more important than a lecture had just ended. Chairs shifted slowly, one by one, the sound of metal legs against tile breaking the stillness as students began to gather their things, but no one spoke above a whisper, as if the room itself demanded a certain respect for what had just happened. Elijah slid his notebook into his backpack with the same quiet precision he had carried all morning, his fingers brushing lightly against the worn fabric as he zipped it closed. Across the room, a student glanced at him, then quickly looked away, unsure of what expression belonged in a moment like this. Respect, curiosity, something closer to apology, none of it fully formed. Professor Halvorsen remained near the board, not addressing anyone, not moving to leave, his eyes tracing the equation again as if it might reveal something new on a second look. But it did not change. It held steady, complete, the truth of it no longer something he could shape or redirect. Elijah stood, slipping one strap of his backpack over his shoulder, then the other, the weight settling across his back familiar and grounding. He stepped into the aisle, moving toward the door with the same measured pace he had walked to the front earlier. But the room felt different now, the air no longer tight with expectation but open, uncertain, a space where something had shifted and had not yet found its final place. As he passed the front row, one student hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Hey, just that. Nothing more." Elijah paused for half a second, just enough to acknowledge it, then nodded once and kept walking, not dismissive, not inviting, just steady. At the front, the board still carried the solution, the faint underline beneath it catching the light at a different angle, subtle but present. Halvorsen finally turned as Elijah approached the door, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Not long, not dramatic, but long enough to hold something unspoken. The professor's expression had changed, the sharp edges softened, replaced by something heavier, something closer to reflection than authority. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, then stopped, the words not ready, or perhaps not enough. Elijah gave a small nod, respectful, then pushed the door open. The hallway beyond brighter, louder, filled with the distant hum of other classes, footsteps, conversations. Life continuing without knowledge of what had just unfolded inside that room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and for a moment, Halvorsen stood alone with the equation, the silence settling back in around him. He stepped closer to the board again, lifting his hand slowly, hesitating just inches from the final line, then stopping, as if touching it might erase more than chalk. Behind him, the last few students slipped out quietly, leaving the room empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. He exhaled, long and slow, his shoulders lowering as the weight of the moment settled. Fully, not as a loss, not as defeat, but as something more complicated, something that did not fit into the structure he had spent years building. His gaze moved to the third line again, the correction still there, small but undeniable, and for the first time, he did not look for a way to justify it. He simply saw it, accepted it. The board reflected his image back at him, slightly distorted in the glossy surface. A man who had walked into the room certain of his place, now standing inside a question he could not ignore. Outside, Elijah moved down the hallway, blending into the flow of students, his steps unhurried, his expression calm, but his eyes carried something quieter, something that had nothing to do with proving a point and everything to do with understanding one. And as he reached the end of the corridor, he slowed just slightly, glancing down at his hands, faint traces of chalk dust still clinging to his fingertips. He rubbed them together once, the powder disappearing into the lines of his skin, and then he kept walking, leaving behind a room where something invisible had moved, and a man who was still trying to understand how. The hallway noise wrapped around Elijah the moment he stepped fully into it, voices overlapping, lockers closing, footsteps echoing in uneven rhythms. But it all felt distant, like sound filtered through glass. He moved with the current, but not inside it. His mind still tracing lines, still following the quiet logic that had already settled long before the chalk ever moved. A group of students passed him going the opposite direction. One of them slowed just enough to glance back, recognition flickering in his eyes before he quickly looked away, unsure what to do with it. Elijah kept walking, his shoulders relaxed, his pace steady, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the moment in that classroom belonged somewhere else. Behind him, out of reach, he reached the stairwell door and pushed it open, the metal handle cool against his palm, the space inside quieter, the hum of fluorescent lights softer, footsteps echoing in a hollow, measured way. He started down the stairs, one level, then another, each step grounding him back into something simpler, something real, his hand brushing lightly along the rail, the faint smell of dust and old paint lingering in the air. Halfway down, he paused for a brief second, not from hesitation, but from awareness, the feeling that something was still unresolved, not in the equation, not in the room he had left, but somewhere deeper, something that had been building long before today. He exhaled slowly, then continued, pushing the door open to the lower hallway, where the light shifted warmer, softer, late morning sun filtering through narrow windows, casting long lines across the floor. He walked toward the far exit, the one few students used, his reflection briefly appearing in the glass panel beside the door. Hoodie, backpack, chalk dust gone, nothing about him marking what had just happened. He pushed outside, the air cooler, a light breeze moving across the campus lawn, carrying the distant sound of a bell tower marking the hour. He stepped onto the concrete path, the sky wide above him, open, unchanged, and for the first time since the class began, his shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension leaving in a quiet, almost invisible release. He moved toward a bench near the edge of the courtyard, one he had used before, tucked beneath a tree that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns across the ground. He sat down, leaning forward, forearms resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, his gaze lowered not in defeat but in thought. The equation replayed in his mind, not as a challenge, not as something to prove, but as something complete, something finished long before it was seen. A memory surfaced, faint but steady, the night before, his small desk, a single lamp casting warm light over pages filled with symbols, the quiet scratch of his pen, the slow unraveling of a problem that had not felt impossible, just patient, just waiting to be understood. He had closed the notebook then, not with triumph, but with calm, knowing it was enough, knowing he did not need an audience to confirm it. A soft sound brought him back, footsteps approaching on the gravel path. He looked up slightly, not fully, just enough to register movement. A figure slowed near the edge of the courtyard, hesitated, then continued walking past. Another glance, another moment of recognition that did not turn into words. Elijah looked back down at his hands, turning them slightly, as if expecting to see something still there, some trace of what had happened. But there was nothing, just skin, just quiet. He leaned back against the bench, eyes lifting to the branches above, the leaves shifting gently in the breeze, light flickering between them in soft, uneven patterns. And in that moment, the question that lingered was not about how the chalk moved, not about what the professor had seen, but something simpler, something quieter. What happens when truth no longer needs to be proven, only recognized, and whether the room he had left was ready for that, or if it would try to forget what it could not explain. The breeze shifted slightly, carrying the distant hum of conversation across the courtyard, but the bench where Elijah sat remained quiet, tucked just far enough away to feel separate. His gaze stayed on the moving pattern of light above him, branches swaying, shadows stretching and folding across each other like equations without symbols. Consistent but never still, he breathed slowly, steady, as if matching that rhythm. A faint vibration in his pocket pulled him back, subtle but persistent. He reached in and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up against his palm. A message, then another, notifications stacking faster than usual, names he recognized from class, from group chats he rarely spoke in, from numbers he did not have saved at all. He hesitated for a second before unlocking it. The first message opened without effort. Was that real? Followed by another. Did you plan that? And another. How did you do it? The words blurred together after a moment. Not aggressive, not mocking, just uncertain, searching, trying to make sense of something that did not fit into what they knew. Elijah stared at the screen, his thumb hovering but not typing, not answering, because the question they were asking was not the one he would respond to. Not yet. He locked the phone again, the screen going dark, the questions still there but unanswered, a quiet distance between what they wanted and what he was willing to explain. Footsteps approached again, slower this time, deliberate. He did not look up immediately, but he felt the presence stop just a few feet away, the slight shift of weight on gravel, the pause before words. Elijah. The voice came careful, not loud, not demanding. He looked up then, meeting the eyes of a student from the front row. Daniel. Tall, usually confident, now standing with his hands loosely at his sides, unsure of where to place them. That was, Daniel started, then stopped, searching for something that did not sound wrong. I did not think. He trailed off again, the sentence collapsing under its own weight. Elijah waited, not impatient, just present. Daniel exhaled quietly, then tried again. I did not think anyone could solve it. He said finally, more honest this time. Elijah nodded once, acknowledging the statement but not accepting its limitation. It can be solved, he replied, simple, direct, not expanding. Daniel shifted slightly, his brow furrowing. Yeah, but not like that, he said, glancing back toward the building as if the answer might still be written there. Elijah followed the glance briefly, then looked back at him. You are looking at how it happened, he said, not why it worked. The distinction landed in a quieter way than before. Daniel went still for a moment, processing, his usual certainty replaced by something more open, more uncertain. So why did it work? He asked, this time not as a challenge, but as a question he genuinely wanted answered. Elijah leaned back slightly against the bench, his gaze lifting again toward the branches above. Because it was already true, he said, his voice calm, steady. Daniel blinked, the answer not fitting into the frame he expected, but something about it held, something that did not need immediate clarity to matter. He nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but no longer dismissing. Right. He said quietly, more to himself than to Elijah. The space between them settled into something neutral, no longer divided by assumption, but not yet defined by understanding. Daniel took a step back, hesitated, then added, for what it is worth. That was impressive. The words came careful, not performative, just honest. Elijah met his eyes for a second, then nodded once. Thank you, he said, not with pride, not with deflection, just acknowledgement. Daniel gave a small nod in return, then turned, walking back toward the building, his pace slower than before, as if carrying something new. Elijah watched him go for a moment, then looked back down at his hands, resting quietly in his lap, the world around him continuing as it always had, but with a subtle shift, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to remind him that sometimes the hardest part is not solving the problem, but changing the way people see who is allowed to solve it. The courtyard did not change, not in any obvious way. Students still crossed the paths in clusters. Laughter rose and fell in uneven waves. The bell tower rang again in the distance, marking another hour that moved forward without hesitation. But something underneath it all felt slightly off balance, as if a quiet shift had taken place that only a few could feel. Elijah remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze drifting across the open lawn, tracking movement without focusing on any single point. His phone stayed still in his hand, silent now, but heavy with questions he had chosen not to answer. He slipped it back into his pocket and pushed himself up from the bench, the wood creaking softly beneath him. He stood there for a second, adjusting the strap of his backpack across his shoulder, grounding himself in something simple, something physical. Then he began walking again, not toward the main buildings, but along the edge of the campus where the pathways grew quieter, the sounds softer. His steps matched the rhythm of his breathing, steady, unhurried, as if he had nowhere he needed to be except forward. Behind him, the classroom he had left continued to exist, the equations still on the board, the questions still unresolved. But here, under the open sky, it felt distant, like something already completed. He passed a row of windows reflecting the outside world back at him, his image moving alongside the trees and sky, blending into something larger, less defined. A voice carried faintly from behind him, not calling out, just speaking to someone else. "Did you hear about what happened?" Followed by a second voice. "Yeah. They are saying it solved itself." The words faded as he kept walking, but the tone lingered, the uncertainty, the attempt to explain what did not fit into simple categories. Elijah did not turn, did not react. He had heard enough already to understand how quickly a moment could become a story, and how easily that story could shift away from the truth. He reached the far end of the path where a small building stood apart from the others. Older, quieter, its brick walls worn slightly by time. He slowed as he approached, his hand brushing lightly against the cool surface as he passed. The texture rough beneath his fingertips, real, grounded, unlike the abstract weight of everything that had happened. Inside, the building held a different kind of silence, not tense, not uncertain. Chalkboard at the front, untouched, clean. Waiting, he walked toward it without thinking, his steps echoing faintly in the open space. When he reached the board, he paused, his hand hovering for a second before reaching down to the tray. Picking up a piece of chalk, it felt the same as before, dry, light, familiar. He lifted it to the surface, not to prove anything, not to recreate what had happened, but simply to write. A single line at first, then another, the movement steady, controlled, the equation forming again, not identical, not copied, but built from the same understanding, the same quiet certainty. There was no movement this time beyond his own hand, no unexplained shift, no watching eyes, just him and the board and the logic that connected them. And as the symbols took shape, the room remained silent, unchanged, the truth of it no longer needing anything beyond the act itself. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls of that quiet room, the version of what had happened earlier continued to spread, growing, shifting, becoming something else entirely. While here, in this stillness, the original remained exactly what it had always been. The chalk moved steadily across the board, each line forming with quiet precision, Elijah's hand guiding the motion without hesitation, the symbols aligning into a structure that felt almost inevitable. The room around him remained still, untouched by the tension that had filled the earlier classroom. Here there was no audience, no shifting glances, no expectation waiting to be confirmed or denied. Just the soft sound of chalk against surface and the faint echo of his own breathing. He paused. For a moment, stepping back slightly to take in what he had written, not searching for validation, just observing. The equation stood complete again, different in form but identical in truth, the same logic unfolding in a way that did not depend on who watched it. A faint reflection caught his attention in the glass panel near the door, someone standing just outside, partially obscured by the angle. Elijah did not turn immediately. Instead, he reached up and brushed a small trace of chalk dust from the edge of the board, a simple gesture, grounding. Then he set the chalk down on the tray with a soft click. Only then did he turn. The door opened slowly, the hinge giving a quiet creak, and Professor Halvorsen stepped inside, his presence no longer commanding the space but entering it carefully, as if unsure of how much weight he still carried here. He paused just a few steps in, his eyes moving from Elijah to the board, taking in the equation, the structure, the clarity of it, and something in his expression shifted again, not shock this time, not disbelief, but recognition. Deeper, quieter, he walked forward, stopping a few feet from the board, his gaze tracing the lines, following the logic step by step, the same way Elijah had earlier, but now without the barrier of assumption. "You rewrote it," he said, his voice low, measured. Elijah nodded once. "I needed to see it again," he replied. the honesty of it simple, unguarded. Halvorsen glanced at him briefly, then back to the board, without the quieter now, almost reflective. No one solves it. He paused, his eyes shifting to Elijah. Until today. The words hung there, not as a conclusion, but as a turning point. Elijah looked at the board once more, then back at him. It was always solvable, he said, calm, steady. Just not the way you were looking at it. The statement settled into the room, not challenging, not correcting, but expanding. Halvorsen nodded slowly, absorbing it, the idea reshaping something internal, something he had not questioned before. The silence returned, but it felt different again, not heavy, not uncertain, but open, like a space where something new could begin. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, standing there between what had been taught and what had just been understood, the board still carrying the answer, but no longer as a test, now as something closer to a reminder. Halvorsen did not move right away, his eyes still fixed on the board as if the solution had become something more than mathematics, something that now reflected back at him in ways he had not prepared for. The quiet in the room stretched, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, like a space where old assumptions had been cleared but nothing had yet taken their place. He finally stepped back, the soft sound of his shoes against the floor marking the shift. I built an entire lecture around that problem, he said, his voice carrying a weight that was no longer about authority but about reflection. Elijah remained where he was, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, not pressing, not retreating, simply present. Halvorsen let out a slow breath, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the desk beside him, grounding himself in something physical, something certain. Every year, he continued, I watch students try and fail, and I tell myself it is because the problem is beyond them. He paused, his eyes lifting from the board to Elijah. But maybe it is not beyond them. The words hung in the air, unfinished, as if waiting for their full meaning to arrive. Elijah tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement. Sometimes it is not about how hard the problem is, he said quietly. It is about how early people decide it cannot be solved. The statement landed gently, but it carried further than volume ever could. Halvorsen's expression shifted again, something deeper settling behind his eyes, something closer to understanding than defensiveness. He nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a truth that had been present all along but never examined. And sometimes, he added, his voice softer now, it is about who we think is capable of solving it. The admission came without. Simple, direct. Halvorsen gave a small nod in return, then stepped out into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. The room returned to silence, the equation still standing, unchanged. Elijah remained where he was for a moment longer, his eyes moving once more across the lines he had written, not to check them, not to question them, but to acknowledge them. Then he reached down, picked up his bag, and turned toward the door, stepping out into a space that felt just slightly different than before, not because the world had changed, but because something in the way it was seen had shifted, and that shift, quiet as it was only beginning. The hallway outside felt narrower than before, not because the walls had changed, but because Elijah could feel the weight of what tomorrow would bring settling quietly into his steps. He walked past rows of closed doors, each one holding a different class, a different version of certainty being taught inside. His reflection flickered briefly in a glass case filled with awards and framed achievements, names etched in gold, dates marking years of recognition. He slowed for just a moment, not to compare, not to measure, but to observe, then kept moving, his pace steady, his mind already shifting towards something deeper than the moment itself. The invitation had not sounded like authority, it had sounded like need, and that was different. That meant something had already begun to change. He pushed through the exit doors and stepped back into the open air, the afternoon sun lower now, casting longer shadows across the campus walkways. Students gathered in small groups, conversations layered with energy, but there was a subtle shift in the way a few of them looked at him now, not openly, not all of them, but enough to be noticed, a pause in conversation, a glance that lingered a second too long, curiosity replacing assumption. He did not react. He kept walking, letting the moment pass through him without holding on to it. As he crossed the courtyard, he noticed Daniel again near the steps, speaking to two others, Their heads leaned in slightly, their voices low. When Daniel looked up and saw Elijah, he stopped mid-sentence. The others followed his gaze, and for a brief second, the three of them stood there, caught between what they thought they knew and what they had just witnessed. Daniel gave a small nod, not performative, just acknowledgement. Elijah returned at once, then continued forward, the distance between them closing and then widening again as he passed, leaving the conversation behind without needing to hear the rest of it. He reached the far side of the campus where the buildings thinned out and the noise softened, the path leading toward a quieter stretch lined with trees, the leaves shifting gently in the late afternoon breeze, the light filtering through in patterns that moved slowly across the ground. He walked until he reached the same bench from earlier, pausing beside it this time instead of sitting, his hand resting lightly on the backrest, the wood warm from the sun. He stood there, looking out across the open space, letting the stillness settle around him again. His thoughts did not race. They aligned, like the steps of a solution that had already been worked through. Tomorrow would not be about proving anything. That part had already passed. Tomorrow would be about something harder, something quieter, understanding, and whether that understanding could exist without the need to defend itself. He glanced down at his hands again, turning them slightly in the light. No chalk this time, no trace left behind. Just skin, just stillness. A faint sound reached him from behind, the distant echo of a classroom door closing somewhere across campus. A reminder that the day was moving forward whether he paused or not. He exhaled slowly, then stepped away from the bench, continuing down the path, his pace unhurried, his posture relaxed. But beneath it all, there was a quiet awareness, something that had shifted not just in how others saw him, but in how the space around him responded. And as he walked, the question that lingered was no longer about the equation, no longer about the moment in the classroom, but about what happens when someone who has been underestimated stops trying to fit into expectations and simply stands inside truth, and whether those who once held the power to define that truth are ready to face it when it no longer belongs to them. The next day arrived without announcement, just a shift in light through Elijah's window, pale morning stretching across the room as if nothing had changed, but he felt it before he moved, the quiet weight of what had been set in motion. He dressed without hurry, the routine grounding, familiar, each step steady, deliberate, as if preparing for something that did not require performance but presence. The campus looked the same when he arrived. Students moving between buildings, coffee cups in hand, conversations overlapping in casual rhythms. But there was a subtle difference now, not in the space itself, but in the way it held him. A few glances lingered longer than before, a few voices softened as he passed, not out of fear, not even respect fully formed, but awareness, the kind that follows something people cannot quite explain. He did not slow, did not change his pace. He walked straight toward the building where the classroom waited, the door at the end of the hallway already open, the light inside cooler, quieter. He stepped in and stopped just inside. The room empty except for one figure at the front. Professor Halvorsen stood near the board, not writing, not preparing notes, just standing, as if he had been there for some time already, thinking. The equation from yesterday was gone now. The board wiped clean, a blank surface reflecting the overhead lights in soft, even lines. Halvorsen turned when he heard the door, his expression different from before, not guarded, not distant, but open in a way that carried its own kind of weight. "You came," he said, simple, without expectation layered into the words. Elijah nodded once, stepping further into the room, his footsteps echoing lightly. "You asked me to," he replied, his tone steady, not hesitant, not assertive, just clear. Halvorsen gave a small nod, acknowledging both the answer and what it implied. He gestured lightly toward the board. "I erased it," he said, almost as if explaining himself. Elijah's gaze moved to the clean surface, then back to him. "Why?" he asked, not challenging, just curious. Halvorsen exhaled slowly, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the desk as he spoke. "Because I realized I was using it the wrong way," he said, his voice measured, thoughtful. "It was never meant to prove that no one could solve it." He paused, his eyes lifting to meet Elijah's. "It became that because of how I presented it." The admission settled into the room without resistance. Without defense, Elijah listened. His posture unchanged, but something in his expression softened slightly. Recognition, not of fault, but of honesty. Halvorsen stepped closer to the board, picking up a piece of chalk, turning it between his fingers as if testing its weight. Then he stopped, lowering his hand before writing anything. "I want to understand how you saw it," he said, not as a demand, not even as a request, but as an opening. Elijah took a few steps forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes resting on the blank board, not rushing to fill it, not claiming it, just seeing it for what it was, a space without assumption, a space without expectation. He reached for the chalk, his fingers brushing briefly against Halvorsen's as he took it. A small, human moment, unnoticed but real. He lifted it to the board and paused, not from uncertainty, but from intention. "It starts here," he said quietly, drawing the first line. Simple, clear, not the same beginning as before, not the same structure, but something that led toward the same truth. Halvorsen watched closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just following, his attention no longer divided by expectation, but focused on understanding. And as the first few steps formed, the room held a different kind of silence, not the tension of judgment, but the presence of learning, something that neither of them had fully shared before. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, not loud, not dramatic, but deeper. The beginning of a change that would not be measured by a single moment, but by what came after it. The chalk moved slowly at first, each line placed with intention, not rushed, not performed, just understood. Elijah's hand steady as he built the structure piece by piece, not recreating what had happened the day before, but revealing the path in a way that could be followed. Halvorsen stood beside him, not above, not behind, but next to him, his gaze fixed on each step, his breathing quieter, more measured, as if he was learning how to listen again. The board filled gradually, not with complexity meant to intimidate, but with clarity that unfolded in its own time. Elijah paused between steps, not to hesitate, but to allow space. Space for the logic to settle, space for it to be seen, not just by him, but by the man standing beside him. "Right here," Elijah said softly, marking a transition point. "This is where it changes." Halvorsen leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing not in doubt, but in focus, following the shift, recognizing it this time without needing it pointed out again. "I missed that," he said quietly, the admission simple, without defense. Elijah did not respond with correction, only continued, letting the solution speak where words did not need to. The final line came into place without tension, without pause, the equation complete once more, not as a spectacle, not as a mystery, but as understanding shared. Elijah lowered the chalk and set it gently on the tray, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. He stepped back, giving space not just to the board, but to the moment itself. Halvorsen remained where he was, his eyes tracing the lines again, but this time there was no search for error, no need to reclaim control, only recognition. He exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more than just the present. "I have been asking the wrong question," he said, almost to himself. Elijah glanced at him, not surprised, just listening. Halvorsen turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "I kept asking why no one could solve it," he continued, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Instead of asking how I was preventing them from seeing it." The words settled into the room, not heavy, not sharp, but clear. Elijah nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in acknowledgement of something earned, something realized. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt complete, like the final line of the equation itself. Nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, just something understood. Outside, the faint sound of students moving through the hallway drifted in, the world continuing, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside this room. Halvorsen stepped back from the board, his posture different now, not diminished, but grounded, his authority no longer built on distance, but on awareness. He glanced once more at the solution, then at Elijah, and gave a small nod. Not formal, not performative, but real. Elijah returned it the same way. Quiet, equal. He reached for his bag, lifting it onto his shoulder, his movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing more needed to be said. He turned toward the door, pausing just briefly before stepping out, not waiting for permission, not needing acknowledgement, just moving forward. The hallway outside welcomed him with the same familiar noise, footsteps, voices, the rhythm of a day in motion. But something in that movement felt different now, not louder, not clearer, just wider, as if space had opened where there had once been limits. Behind him, in the quiet classroom, the equation remained on the board, untouched, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a reminder, and Halvorsen stood there for a moment longer, looking at it, not with the need to own it, but with the understanding that it had never belonged to him in the first place. And somewhere between the chalk lines and the silence, something simple had taken shape, something that did not need to be written to be true, that understanding does not come from power, and respect does not come from proving someone wrong, but from finally seeing them right.